We welcome Reverend Korb. So I will now mute.
Well, I thank you. I've never done this before, so I'm not quite sure how it works. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you, so you can go ahead and begin your.
I'll just go right ahead then.
Thank you, yes.
I want to start with a poem by Madeleine L'Engle from her book, A Swiftly Tilting Planet. With us in this fateful hour, I place all goodness with its power, and the sun with its brightness, and the snow with its whiteness, and the fire with all the strength it hath, and the lightning with its rapid wrath, and the winds with their swiftness along their path, and the sea with its deepness, and the rocks with their steepness, and the earth with its darkness. All these I place by almighty help and grace between us and the powers of darkness. I was going to be fluffy. My goodness, you know, we get so much grim information these days. I was going to try to be light and give people some pleasure. And somehow the thing inside a preacher that tells her what to preach wouldn't let me. So in this fateful hour, I don't know about you, but I'm tired. I'm tired of bad news about climate change, police bias and brutality, systemic oppression, pandemic, a disastrous economy, except for the billionaires, a coordinated effort to remove every regulation to help the workers, the elderly, the poor and oppressed, to hurt the land which holds and nurtures us, the water that sustains us, and they even seem to want to destroy the Constitution that guarantees our freedom. I didn't ask to be born in this hour. If I'd been asked, I would have refused. I'm tired of talking about it, thinking about it, not being able to get a haircut for 6 months, 6 months, for crying out loud. I'm tired of helplessness. I'm just plain tired. But here we are. This is the hour for which we were made, and somehow we have to understand it, deal with it, somehow make it change path, turn into something that changes things for the better rather than the worse. There will be changes that last forever from this time. It's the kind of time that's only happened twice before in human history. And the changes are so huge that chaos, violence, and fear are the first responses. I learned a new word not long ago, a rare event these days, liminal. Suddenly it seemed to be being used by all my colleagues. They'd all read the same book. I looked it up. It was a description of these times of chaos before sweeping change in how we see and deal with the universe, the world, and one another. It was what I had been preaching about over and over for more years than I care to count. Be ready, I would say. These times are coming, and they must, if possible, be directed toward goodness. I'll admit I would have been pleased if it had waited until I was quite through before it had descended upon us. Wasn't any particular prophetic genius on my part, but I had noticed that every time a revolutionary scientific discovery was paired with an equally revolutionary way of storing and sharing data, this kind of thing has happened. The first pair was learning about the regularity of the passage of the seasons and inventing writing. It changed hunters and gatherers into farmers, nomadic tribes into cities, and polytheism into monotheism. The Old Testament of the Bible is all about the unrest that happened at that time. The second was the Copernican revolution in printing, and ended in the Enlightenment, industrialization, and a God who could no longer break his own laws. And the religious wars were a big part of that. Now we have quantum theory and electronic communication and fear and chaos in this fateful hour. Our hour. It's difficult, perhaps impossible, to bring all of this together in any sensible way. Every morning we seem to wake up to a new horror, disconnected from yesterday's or tomorrow's. One day it is taking children away from their refugee parents and putting them in cages to deter any more from coming, even though by international law refugees must be accepted and aided. Another, it is the illustrated story of a police officer radiating indifference, kneeling on the neck of a prone and shackled Black man for just a little less than 9 minutes, ignoring his and bystanders' pleas for him to stop until the man is dead. Again, it is the old man shoved by a policeman, bleeding on the ground while a file of policemen goes by, while poignantly one young officer who instinctively turned to help was pushed forward by the man behind him. The next day, it is the news that the Environmental Protection Agency has rolled back regulations to keep our air and water safe. And after that, a force of unidentified soldiers has invaded an American city. They have now been identified as DHS mercenaries and Federal Border Control and perhaps some other federal military, not police. There's a book I've been reading I love. I don't know how many of you have heard of Terry Pratchett. I think he's the best satirist since Jonathan Swift, and actually better because unlike Jonathan Swift, he tends to believe in redemption. This book is called Jingo. And the main character is the commander of the watch. And he is passionate about the fact that he is not a soldier. He is a policeman. And that is the difference is soldiers are to fight an enemy. Policemen are to keep the peace. These soldiers who came into Portland seemed to be ready to fight an enemy. And then we get the news that over 140,000 US citizens have died of COVID-19. Each horror distracts us from the previous one. And every one of them could be dissected, explained, made the center of a new uprising. For example, the stories about police brutality, primarily against Black men, has been growing, started before that horrible event, but it erupted over the killing of George Floyd, which made it real to people who had dismissed it as just a few bad apples. We learned that police training is essentially based on fear for their own lives. It is impressed on them that every time they go out on patrol, there are people with weapons who want to kill them. They must be forever on fearful alert, and of course, it is Black people that systemic racism teaches them most to fear. All those concepts could be unpacked too, and we could spend years trying to understand it all while it continues. But without understanding, at least how others may feel about it, can only lead to defeat. When I saw the first defund the police sign, I knew that that was a huge gift to those who dismiss racism, systemic racism, and police brutality. And indeed it has been. I have seen 2 right-wing ads. They can't be called conservative since the only thing they seem to wish to conserve is the billions belonging to the super rich and their own guns. But I saw them trying to terrify people with the idea of abolishing police protection. And sometimes that really is what it is, though it's hard to fault Black people for not believing that. But that's just one of all these issues. Maybe what we should do is just pick one and hope that somebody else will pick up the rest. And there are more than the ones I've named so far. I've just thought of 2 more that fill my email box and fill my mind. But I think there really is something that we can concentrate on that will help with all of them, or at least nearly all. So you're about to get my election sermon. Don't worry, the IRS will not start sending you tax bills. Every election time, there are 3 evangelical ministers who videotape their election sermons and send them to the IRS. And to their disappointment, they have never gotten a response. I think they're trying to get grounds for a lawsuit based on First Amendment religious rights. And I suspect that the IRS fears they would win such a suit, as I suspect they might. And besides, I'm not your minister, so it's not your fault. The election sermon was an honored tradition in churches before the IRS decided that churches should follow the same rules as nonprofits. My favorite story about our last Unitarian president was his visit to the Community Church of New York when John Haynes Holmes was giving his election sermon. Holmes was an impassioned pacifist, and he was urging his congregation to vote for Woodrow Wilson, who had promised to keep us out of World War I. As they were leaving the church, Taft remarked mildly to one of his aides, "At least he didn't pass the plate for him." I have broken this rule once before, when I considered the issue of voting for either of the candidates for governor of Louisiana a moral rather than political one. One candidate was a former governor who was noted for his financial machinations, but the other was David Duke, Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and one of the founders of the White Citizens Council. I told them that this kind of bigotry was far worse than theft. And at least former Governor Edwards had a sense of humor. And luckily enough, others agreed with me that Edwards was reelected. I saw bumper stickers saying, "Vote for the crook. It's important." We will have in November a similar moral tour. I think with far more impact than a governor's race. And it is one, I think, that has some effect on most, perhaps all, of the issues I have identified as horrifying and yes, exhausting. When I woke up on that morning in 2016 and heard that the Electoral College would be naming a lying, narcissistic sociopath, an immature bully, a data-averse ignoramus as president, I was shocked, but not particularly surprised. I was comforted a bit by the fact that he did not win the popular vote, and the hope that, as some people do grow in office, he might be one of them. That hope was soon dashed. His cabinet appointments were all people who were committed to destroying the departments of which they were put in charge. For example, Betsy DeVos in the education department, who was an enemy of public education, and profited from private charter schools. There was a fossil fuel magnate for environment who had filed numerous suits against the EPA. There were others, but in order to find them, I would have to look up some data. I could go on, but you know the list. His ignorance of the document he swore to uphold, his cruelty and self-absorption, and more. When some people say that they don't like Trump himself, but they like his policies, I always want to say which ones. The ones that put children in cages to deny access to refugees. The ones that drove farmers to bankruptcy and some to suicide. The ones that alienate our friends and give comfort to our declared enemies. The ones that denied knowledge of the coronavirus or its seriousness until it was too late. It seems that Joe Biden will be the Democratic candidate. He was not my choice. But he is a good man. He is a man of compassion, with a wide knowledge of competent people whom he could name to form the government. I can't and won't try to tell you for whom to vote. That is entirely up to you. But I won't let you doubt my opinion. There's another issue, though, and that is that Trump is merely a symptom of a deep divide in our country. That he himself is such a moral and competence disaster, which of course is why the Russians wanted him elected, is not the disease. The disease is fear. Fear of change, fear of losing one's identity, one's country, perhaps one's God. This fear can justify almost anything to assuage it. The rise of authoritarianism, the willingness to destroy one's country in order to save it, the rise of racism and xenophobia, and eagerness to give up everyone else's liberty for our own safety. So what we need to focus on before any of these other urgent matters, except perhaps our own safety from disease, is making sure the vote in November is as fair and accessible as it can be, that everyone understands its urgency, that efforts to stop people from voting must not succeed, as it must not succeed to try to declare the election invalid. We need to look at other races, at others who do not honor democracy, who enable incompetence for their own profit. It is necessary to be alert at all times. This is the fateful hour. It is our hour, however we might wish that it was not, that we had been spared it. It is also for us, if we can, to make sure that goodness prevails against the powers of darkness. Amen.